"Follow the dog." Derek Strand's voice cut sharper than the engine. Captain Tanner turned the wheel without looking. The spotlight held the animal, dark shape, pale eyes, steady stroke against a current no dog should have been holding, and the boat pushed into water where no street existed anymore, and every man aboard felt the next hour was going to break something in them. Before we go on, tell me in the comments what part of the world you're watching from, and subscribe so a story like this doesn't slip past you. The rain had been falling on Ashland Bend for 31 hours before anyone at Engine House 22 put their coats on. The Missouri River had never crested that high in living memory, not in the drought years, not in the 2 flood decades before, and the older firefighters kept saying that to each other because saying it out loud made it feel less true. When the first warning ripped across the county radio around 6 in the evening, Bill Tanner was standing in the kitchen of the firehouse, holding a coffee that had gone cold in his hand. He had been captain of that house for 11 years. He knew every square inch of Ashland Bend, the way a man knew the freckles on his own arm. And when the dispatcher's voice said the words, "Levy compromise," he set the coffee down without spilling a drop and walked to the bay. By 7 o'clock, the water was in the storm drains and rising. By 8, it was on the low blocks near the fairgrounds. By 9, the mayor's emergency line stopped answering. And by 10, when Engine 22's rescue boat left the drop point at the corner of Willow and 4th and slid out onto what had been Hargrove Street 12 hours earlier, the city was no longer a city. It was a black lake with rooftops sticking out of it, and somewhere on that lake were 6 addresses on a paper list that had already been sitting in Tanner's coat pocket for 3 hours, and the fuel gauge on the outboard read 58%, and the rain came down so thick that Tanner had to shout to be heard over it. That was when Derek Strand saw the dog. Strand was 37 years old, and he had spent 9 of the last 13 years of his life in water that could kill him. He had trained in the Coronado surf until his shoulders felt like something someone else was carrying. He had done cold water insertion drills off Kodiak in February. He had been to places you could not point at on a map, and he had come home 3 years ago because his youngest brother had told him, on a porch in Kansas City in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, that Mama could not take one more phone call from a chaplain. So Strand had come home, and he had taken a firefighter test at 34, and he had put on the uniform of Engine 22, and he had learned that the town he had grown up in was quiet enough that he could sleep at night without his hands twitching under the blanket most nights, though not all. He had a habit that the other firefighters teased him about. He read water the way older cops read faces. He could tell you from 100 feet away whether a swimmer was in trouble or just showing off. And when he leaned over the port rail of the rescue boat and squinted through the spotlight into the wall of rain, he did not see a drowning dog. He saw something else. The animal was maybe 40 feet off the bow, on the far edge of the light, and it was cutting a line through the current with a rhythm that had no fear in it. Its head was up. Its tail streamed behind it like a rudder. Every few strokes it turned that head and looked back at the boat, with a pair of eyes that caught the spotlight like 2 coins at the bottom of a well. And then it faced forward again and pulled another 6 feet through water that was moving at a speed no house pet was supposed to fight. "Bill," Strand said. Tanner had the radio to his ear. He was trying to get a call back from a dispatcher who had gone silent 4 minutes earlier. "Not now, Derek." "Bill, look." Tanner looked. He was a stocky, silver-haired man who had grown up on a river and had learned young that rivers did not care what a man's list said. He watched the dog for exactly 7 seconds, and in those 7 seconds he watched a shepherd-shaped animal in absolute control of its own body, cutting a heading through the dark like a soldier crossing a rifle range. He also watched it turn its head twice and look at his boat with what he could only describe later to his wife as expectation. "That dog's swimming toward something," Strand said quietly. Tanner tapped the paper list against the wheel. "We have 6 addresses. We got maybe 55 minutes of fuel. The gymnasium's northwest. That's where the survivors are supposed to be. That dog is not confused. How can you tell? Strand's voice dropped, the way it always dropped when he was very sure of something. Because panic doesn't look like that. Purpose does. That is purpose. I've watched men in the water for 9 years, Bill. That dog is not confused. That dog is on task. For a long moment, there was only the rain, the outboard, and the 2 other men on the boat, Jorge Ramirez and Tommy Delaney, both of them under 30, both of them staring at their captain, because their captain was the one who was supposed to make this kind of decision. Ramirez had been a firefighter for 4 years. Delaney had been one for 8 months. Neither of them had ever been in weather that had this kind of appetite in it. Tanner looked at the fuel gauge. Then he looked at the dog. Then he swore quietly under his breath and turned the wheel a quarter to starboard. "Follow it," he said. Strand did not smile. He did not say, "Thank you." He picked up the second spotlight and clipped it to his belt and moved to the bow. 12 minutes into that new heading, a wall of water hit them. Later, in the report, they would learn that a drainage channel 4 blocks over had built up behind a collapsed section of chain link and had finally punched free. In the moment, all Strand knew was that the boat lurched 40 degrees in half a second and that a duffel bag full of blankets, a spare flashlight, and one of the emergency dry sacks all went over the port rail. Ramirez grabbed the gunwale and grabbed Delaney's coat and held both. Tanner braced against the console. The outboard screamed, and when the boat rocked back level and the spotlight swept the water in a wide, panicked arc, the dog was gone. Nobody said anything. Tanner exhaled. "All right, reset, turn back northwest, and we—" The bark came out of the dark. It was one bark, low from somewhere off the starboard bow, and it did not sound like a dog calling for help. It sounded like a dog telling someone to hurry up. Strand had the paddle in his hand before Tanner finished the sentence. He drove it into the water on the port side and pivoted the boat 60 feet through the flooded lot of what had once been a small yellow house. And there, over the low edge of what had once been a covered back porch, the spotlight caught the shape of a boy. The boy was pinned. A 10-foot section of aluminum gutter had come down at an angle across his back, along with a lattice frame and the piece of trellis that had once been the porch corner. He was face down. He was not moving. The porch itself was about 3 feet above the floodline, but the water was still rising, and there was maybe another 20 minutes before the porch went under too. Strand was over the rail before Tanner said the word, "Go." The dog was in the water on the porch edge. It was treading in place, with its head pressed up against the boy's cheek, holding its own nose against the boy's skin, and it did not stop. Not when the boat came up, not when Strand climbed up onto the porch, not when Ramirez ran a line from the boat cleat to the porch post. The dog stayed there with its face against the boy's face, like a nurse taking a pulse she was afraid to lose. Strand felt the boy's neck. There was a heartbeat. It was so faint he had to close his eyes to be sure of it, but it was there. "Alive," he called. Tanner had the radio out. "Dispatch, Engine 22, rescue. We have a live miner, male, approximately 9 years old, unconscious, blunt trauma, need transport priority. What is our nearest triage?" Strand did not wait for the answer. He put both hands under the edge of the collapsed gutter, and he braced his boots against the porch decking, and he lifted. The metal was slick with rain, and the lattice frame had a nail sticking out of it that took a piece of his forearm on the way up, but the boy came free, and Ramirez was there with a backboard, and the 2 of them got the boy onto the board and passed him hand over hand into the boat. The dog came last. It came over the rail without a sound, and it walked on trembling legs over to the backboard where the boy was strapped and lying still, and it lay down beside him with its head across his ankles, and it did not move again for a very long time. Tanner throttled the engine forward. "Northwest triage is closer than the hospital. 10 minutes. Strand nodded. He was crouched by the boy, watching the boy's chest rise, then rise again, then rise a third time. He was so focused on that chest that he did not, at first, notice what the dog was wearing. Around its neck was a black nylon collar that had been through weather. Threaded through the D-ring was a metal tag, small, round, dull silver, the kind you had to hold up to the light to read. It was the kind of tag a certain kind of man wore around his neck for years and never took off, and when he wanted his dog to carry it, he clipped it on, because he thought it was funny to make the dog carry his tags for him. Strand had known one man like that. He had known one man like that his entire adult life, and that man had been dead for 4 years and 1 month. He reached toward the collar. His fingers were shaking. He told himself later it was the cold. He turned the tag over in his fingers, and he read the name stamped into the metal, and he stopped breathing for the count of 3. Reese. He looked at the boy on the backboard. He looked at the boy's face. He looked at the boy's mouth, which was slightly open, and he looked at the boy's jawline, and he saw the ghost of a face he had eaten meals with in 7 countries. "Bill," he said. His voice did not sound like his own. "Bill, this is Marcus Reese's kid." Tanner did not turn around because Tanner was piloting a boat in the dark, but his shoulders went stiff, and after a second he said quietly, "Are you telling me?" "That is Caleb Reese," Strand said. "This is Marcus's boy, and this dog." He looked at the dog, and the dog looked up at him, and its pale eyes caught the running light on the port side and held it. "This dog is wearing Marcus's tags." "Christ," Tanner said. "His dog," Strand said. "Marcus's dog. He wrote me about this dog 2 years ago. He wrote me—" Strand stopped. He put the tag down gently, back against the shepherd's chest, and he sat back on his heels. He was 37 years old, and he was crying without knowing he was crying, because Marcus Reese had died on a beach on the wrong side of the world. And Derek Strand had carried that beach with him for 4 years, and now a dog wearing Marcus's tags had swum out into a flooded street in Missouri and had led him to a 9-year-old boy on a porch. "He named the dog Ranger," Strand said. "He wrote me, he said he found the puppy in a yard sale box. Somebody was giving it away. He said it looked at him and it decided he was the one, and he took it home, and he wrote me about it. He said his boy needed a dog." Ranger's tail thumped once, slow, against the deck. Ramirez was staring at Strand. Delaney was staring at Ramirez. Neither of them said anything. Tanner cleared his throat. "The mother, Rachel Reese, she works at Providence, right? Night shift, ER nurse." "Yeah," Strand said. "Yeah, Rachel. She's going to be there when we get there." Strand closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them, and he wiped his face with the back of his glove, and he leaned forward again and put 2 fingers on Caleb's neck to feel the pulse and count it. And he said, "Then let's not lose him, Bill. Let's not lose him." Tanner opened the throttle up as much as he dared and pointed the bow at the flare he could see 3 blocks off, where triage had set up on the raised loading dock of a lumber yard. The rain kept coming. Rachel Reese found out her son was on a rescue boat because a firefighter she used to babysit walked into the ER in a wet coat and said her name. She had been on shift for 9 hours already. She had triaged a broken hip, a bad laceration from a broken window, an 82-year-old man from a nursing home whose oxygen tank had run out because the power went, and she had been standing in the supply closet crying for exactly 40 seconds because she could not raise her mother-in-law's landline, and because she had told Caleb at 3 that afternoon before she left that he was to stay on the 2nd floor no matter what happened. Rachel Reese was 34 years old. She had been a widow for 4 years and 1 month. Her husband had been the calm one, the anchor, the man who read the sky and told her when to worry. She was on her own, and she had been doing it on her own, and she was very tired. The firefighter's name was Kellen Bird. He was 23. He said, "Rachel, they've got Caleb. He's alive. He's coming in on the 22 boat." Rachel Reese set the clipboard she had been holding down on the counter with both hands because she did not trust her hands. Then she said, "Which trauma bay?" "Bay 2. She walked to Bay 2. She did not run because if she ran, she was going to fall down. And if she fell down, she was going to break. And she was not going to break where her co-workers could see her. She walked into Bay 2, and she stood at the head of the empty gurney, and she put both her hands flat on the paper sheet, and she waited. And when the doors banged open 6 minutes later, and Derek Strand came through them with a small, muddy, blanket-wrapped boy in his arms, Rachel Reese made a sound in her throat that was not quite a word. Strand laid Caleb on the gurney and stepped back. He did not look at her. He was looking at the floor, and his hands were still bleeding a little from the nail on the lattice, and there was a shepherd mix on a leash beside him that had refused to be separated from the boy. Rachel Reese stepped forward, and she put her hand on her son's forehead, and she said in a voice so quiet that only Strand heard her, "Caleb, baby, Mama's here. Mama's here. Open your eyes." She did not know Strand was behind her. She did not know that the man in the wet turnout coat had been the last man to see her husband alive. She did not know any of it, and there was no time for any of it because the trauma team came in with a rush and a stretcher of instruments, and Strand and Ranger were pushed back into the corridor. Ranger sat by the door of Bay 2. He did not move. He did not whine. He put his chin on his paws, and he watched the door. Strand slid down the wall opposite and sat on the floor next to him. He put a hand very lightly on the shepherd's shoulder. "You did good, boy," he said. "You did real good." Ranger did not look at him. Ranger was watching the door. Tanner came in 5 minutes later. His radio was still crackling in his hand. He looked at Strand, and Strand looked back at him, and Tanner said, "There's more. Dispatch is finally back up. There's more, Derek." "How many?" 16 new addresses on the list. 6 of them are in the water." Strand stood up. He put his hand on the top of Ranger's head. He was about to leave when a small, thin voice came from inside Bay 2. "Ranger!" it said. Rachel Reese cried out. Strand froze. Tanner stepped forward. "Ranger!" the voice said again, and it was Caleb's voice, and it was awake. The trauma nurse opened the door. Ranger walked past her without asking permission. He walked to the side of the gurney, and he put his front paws on the rail, and he stretched up until his face was next to Caleb's face. And Caleb, whose eyes were open now, and glassy and confused, reached up with a very small hand and put it on the side of the shepherd's neck. "You brought them," Caleb said. His voice was slurred. "You brought them. Good boy. Good boy." Rachel Reese was crying so hard she could not speak. She had her hand over her mouth. She was holding onto her son's other hand like it was the only thing tying her to the floor. Caleb looked past his mother. He looked at Strand. "Are you the boat?" he said. "Yeah," Strand said. "I'm the boat." Caleb closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them again, and he said, very slowly, "Grandpa Warren. He's still there." He didn't answer. "He's still there." Strand looked at Tanner. Tanner looked at Strand. "Where?" Strand said. Caleb tried to lift his hand. His mother caught it gently and put it back down. 602 Blackthorn, he whispered. "He wouldn't leave. He said he was staying. He said if I came, he would..." His eyes rolled. The nurse touched his shoulder. "He said if I came, he would open the window." Rachel looked up. "Warren is in Blackthorn. That's 4 blocks east of us. The water there is..." "We'll go," Tanner said. "Rachel, we'll go." Ranger climbed down off the rail. He crossed the room. He stood by Strand's leg, and he looked up at him. And Strand knew, without being told, that the dog was ready to go back into the water. "You stay," Strand said. And even as he said it, he knew he was going to lose that argument. He looked at Tanner. "He'll find the house. If we bring him, he'll find the house." Tanner nodded once. "Bring him," Rachel Reese stood up. She let go of Caleb's hand for 1 second, just long enough to cross to Strand, and she put both her hands on his forearms above the wrists. And she looked at him with a face that had been through more than any person should have been through, and she said, "Please bring my father-in-law home." "Yes, ma'am," Strand said. He did not tell her, in that moment, that he had known her husband. He did not tell her that he had been in a boat off a coastline in a country whose name never made the American papers, and that he had been the one carrying Marcus Reese's radio when Marcus Reese said the last words he ever said, which had been about her and about the boy. He did not tell her any of that because the man on Blackthorn Street was still in the water, and because she was a woman who had one son alive tonight, and one thing at a time was already too much. He turned and he walked with the dog back down the corridor toward the ambulance bay, and Tanner walked beside him. "You ready?" Tanner said. "I've been ready for 4 years," Strand said. Outside, the rain was harder. The trip to Blackthorn Street took 18 minutes, and it should have taken 6. Twice they had to backtrack because a downed line was arcing across the surface of the water, and Tanner would not risk the boat under it. Once they took a wrong lot because the street signs were underwater, and the mailboxes had all been ripped off their posts. Once Ranger climbed up onto the bow and stood there like the figurehead of a whaling ship, nose in the wind. And every time the boat drifted the wrong direction, Ranger would turn his head with something that was almost impatience, and Tanner would correct. "He knows," Delaney said. He said it very quietly, as if the dog would be offended by the observation. "Cap, he knows the way. He walked it every day," Strand said. "Marcus told me. He said the kid walked the dog to Grandpa's house after school every day, rain or shine. That was their route." "He's tracking off memory," Tanner said. "He's tracking off memory in the dark, in 6 feet of water, in a rainstorm, at 10:30 at night," Strand said. "But yes, he's tracking off memory." Blackthorn Street had been a row of small houses, most of them built in the 1950s, some of them with wide front porches and single-car garages. Now it was a row of roof peaks and second-story dormers sticking up out of a lake. Ranger stopped moving at the third one on the left. He did not bark. He turned his head and looked at Strand and stared at him. And Strand said, "Here, bring us in here, Bill." The house was a small yellow and white one-story with a partial upstairs that had been carved out of an attic. There was a single dormer window on the east side. The window was open. The window had been open for hours, from the look of it, because rain had soaked the sill and the wallpaper below it, and in the window frame, sitting on a folding chair with a wool blanket around his shoulders and a small brass hurricane lamp in his hand, was an old man. The old man was 72 years old. He was thin and he was grey, and he had the kind of straight-backed posture that only came from a life in a uniform. He watched the rescue boat come up out of the rain, and he lifted the hurricane lamp, and he called out to them in a voice that had not lost its authority. "You took your time," he said. Strand laughed out loud. He could not help it. It came out of him like something that had been holding on for 4 years and had finally been given permission to let go. "Chief Reese," he called back. Warren Reese lowered the lamp. He stared at the man in the bow of the boat, and then his old eyes narrowed and then they went wide, and he said, "Son of a gun, Derek Strand." "Yes, sir," Strand said. "You are a long way from where I last saw you." "Yes, sir." Warren looked past him. He saw Ranger on the bow, and something in his old face broke open just a little. "You came with the dog," he said. "He came for us, sir. Not the other way around." Warren Reese, retired Navy chaplain, 30 years in the service, tried to stand up out of the folding chair and could not. He sat back down. He put his hand against the window frame, and his hand was shaking from cold or age or both. And he said, "Boys, I would very much like to come inside your boat." They got him out of the dormer window with a rope harness and a lot of patience. His hip was bad. His right leg was worse. He had a broken humerus from an old riding fall that had never quite healed, but he was clear-eyed and he was oriented, and when he was in the boat with a blanket around him, he looked at Ranger, and Ranger looked at him, and the old man scratched him under the chin, the way you scratched an old dog you had known for a long time. "Caleb," Warren said quietly. "Alive," Strand said. "At the hospital, he's alive." Warren closed his eyes. For a moment there was only the boat rocking, and the rain, and the sound of a 72-year-old man breathing carefully around a piece of information that had just given him back the last thing he had. Then he opened his eyes and he said, "There's a family in the attic across the alley, the Ellises. I've been watching their light through the window. It went out an hour ago." Strand looked at Tanner. Tanner looked at his fuel gauge. "We have 31% left." "That's still boat," Strand said. Tanner nodded. He was already turning the wheel. Ranger, on the bow, was already looking east. The Ellis family was in the attic of a 2-story on Blackthorn's back alley. There were 5 of them. There was Grant Ellis, who was 41, and there was his wife, Miriam, who was 39, and there were their 3 children, ages ranging from 4 to 12. There was also a small brown mutt named Peaches, who was elderly and mostly blind, and who was wrapped in a bath towel and being held on Miriam's lap because Peaches did not know how to swim anymore. The Ellises had climbed into the attic when the first floor went under. Grant had cut a hole in the roof with a handsaw when the water reached the attic floor. They had been sitting on the roof under a tarp for 2 hours. Miriam had a broken arm from where she had fallen, coming up through the attic ladder in the dark. The 4-year-old was in shock. The 12-year-old had been the one waving the flashlight, and the flashlight had died 40 minutes earlier. When Ranger's bark came out of the black, Miriam Ellis put her forehead against her husband's shoulder and did not move for a long time. They loaded the whole family onto the boat. It was a tight fit. It was maybe more weight than the boat was rated for, but Tanner did not say that out loud, and Strand did not say that out loud, and Warren Reese sat in the middle with his blanket around him and held the 4-year-old in his lap and hummed under his breath a lullaby that his grandmother had hummed to him 70 years earlier. Ranger sat at Strand's feet. He looked satisfied, in the way that only a working dog looked satisfied. The kind of satisfied that said a job that had been given had been done. Grant Ellis looked at Warren. He looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Chief, you know a man named Voss?" Warren's eyes tightened. "Landon Voss?" "Yeah, I know him." "He got me fired," Grant said. He said it flat, the way a man who had lost a job long enough ago to have stopped being angry about it said it. 8 months back, I worked for the county engineer's office. I flagged 3 sections of the levee that were non-compliant. Voss owns the development on the north side of the water. He didn't want the delay. He knew somebody. I was let go on a technicality about paperwork. I told my wife the levee was going to fail. I told anybody who would listen. Miriam and me, we cashed out my pension and paid off the house, so if I couldn't find another job, we wouldn't lose it. That was 7 months ago. Warren looked at the floor of the boat. "You told him," Strand said quietly. "The engineer. You told the engineer." "I told everybody I could tell. I told the paper. The paper wouldn't touch it. Voss has friends at the paper too." There was a silence in the boat that was not a comfortable silence. Then Warren Reese said, in the tone of voice he had used in 30 years of chapel services, "Grant, do you know why the storm sirens on this block did not go off?" Grant looked up. "What?" "The storm sirens," Warren said. "They didn't sound. I've been up in that dormer for 6 hours. They did not sound on this block. They sounded on Grant Street on the west side. I heard those. This side of the water, nothing." "Voss's HOA runs the maintenance contract," Grant said slowly. "That is correct." "Oh my God," Miriam said. "He shut them off," Grant said. "He shut them off." "He would not have wanted a panicked evacuation," Warren said. It would have hurt his sales next quarter. Nobody said anything for a while. Tanner throttled up. They passed a two-story that had once been a rental duplex, and they passed the tops of two mailboxes, and they passed a car that was mostly submerged with its hazard lights, blinking underwater like something in an aquarium. Then Delaney, who had been quiet almost the entire trip, said, "Sir, there's a boat." They all looked. The boat was maybe 2 blocks away, near the intersection where Blackthorn met Sycamore. It was a private craft, a nice one, an inboard runabout with running lights that were not lit. It was drifting with the current, and there were 3 shapes on it, and one of the shapes was standing up and waving a flashlight, and even through the rain Strand could see, when the flashlight caught the man's face, that it was a middle-aged white man in a windbreaker with a very short haircut, and the kind of watch you did not wear in weather. Strand said, "Bill, please tell me that isn't." Tanner was already scowling. "That is Landon Voss." Grant Ellis stiffened. "Bill," Voss called across the water. "Bill Tanner, over here, my boat is dead in the water, I've got my wife and my daughter. Bill, thank God, I've been trying to raise dispatch for an hour. There is no way we survive out here, you have to take us to the shelter. My wife has diabetes, she needs insulin. She has not had a dose since 3 this afternoon." Grant Ellis looked at his wife. Miriam looked at their oldest child, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. Warren Reese put his hand, very lightly, on the 4-year-old's back. "Cap," Ramirez said quietly, "we're already at capacity." "I know we're at capacity. We're above capacity. I know we're above capacity." "Bill," Voss called, "you have to come get us." Strand looked at Tanner. Tanner looked at the boat with the Ellis family in it. He looked at the 72-year-old man and the 9-year-old boy's grandfather who had a broken arm. He looked at the woman with the broken humerus. He looked at the 4-year-old. He looked at the fuel gauge, which said 22%. Then he looked at Voss. Then he looked at Strand. "Derek," he said, "I hear you, Bill. You've done this longer than I have." Strand thought about it for 1 second. Then he said, "We take them. We take them because that's the job. But we do not take them ahead of anybody who is already in this boat. And we do not take them ahead of the next call we get." Tanner nodded once. He turned the wheel. Voss's boat had grounded on the top of what had been a hedge in someone's front yard. Voss's wife was a small blonde woman named Denise, who was shivering under a poncho. Voss's daughter was a college-age girl named Emily, who was so quiet she looked like she had been holding her breath since sundown. Voss himself was doing what men like Voss did when they were scared, which was talking louder. "Bill, I have been calling this in for 2 hours. This is unacceptable. This is exactly the kind of response failure I have been talking about at the county board." "Sit down, Mr. Voss," Tanner said. "I beg your pardon." "I said sit down." Voss sat. Denise Voss looked at Strand as Strand helped her over the rail. Her eyes were huge. She whispered, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "Yes, ma'am," Strand said. The daughter climbed over on her own. She looked at nobody, and she said nothing. Voss came last. He climbed heavily. He was clumsy in the way that men who did not know boats were clumsy. When he got over the rail, he stumbled and put his hand out and caught Grant Ellis on the shoulder, and Grant Ellis stiffened, and Voss looked at him, and Voss's face went blank, and then something else, and he said, "Ellis." "Voss, I did not know you were on this street. You did not know a lot of things." "Bill," Voss said, ignoring Grant, turning back to the captain. "Bill, listen to me, my house is on Ridge." "Mr. Voss," Tanner said without turning around, "your house is on Ridge Road, which is currently on the northwest side, which is 9 blocks in the wrong direction, which is also above the flood line. We are running low on fuel, and we are transporting 8 people plus 1 dog to the triage on Willow. If you cannot sit still and be quiet, I will put you back in your boat. Is that clear?" No, Voss said nothing. "Is that clear?" "Yes." Good. Ranger on the bow had gone very still. Strand watched him. The dog was not looking east anymore. The dog was looking straight ahead, but his ears were up in a way that Strand had learned to read on a shepherd. The dog had heard something. "Bill," Strand said quietly, "I hear you. There's something else. I know." They were passing the corner of Blackthorn and Meridian when the sound came. It was very faint. It was the sound of a hand pounding once, twice, 3 times on wood. It was maybe 40 yards off the port side. Ranger stood up. His ears were pinned forward. He whined once, low. "Left," Strand said. Tanner turned the wheel. The house was a small one-story with a chimney. Someone had climbed onto the chimney and had wedged themselves into the corner where the chimney met the roof, and they had been trying to make noise for a long time. Their voice was hoarse. When the spotlight found them, they threw an arm up over their eyes, and the arm was thin, and Strand recognized with a jolt an elderly black woman in a nightgown and a raincoat, sitting on a chimney at 10:45 at night, in a flood, on a roof, alone. "Ma'am!" Tanner called. "We see you! We are coming!" Her name was Dorothea Kingsley. She was 79. She had lived on that street for 51 years. Her husband had died the previous spring. She had been in her bedroom when the water came, and she had crawled up through the attic with a butter knife, and she had banged on the chimney with her wedding ring for 3 hours because the wedding ring was harder than her knuckles. They got her onto the boat. There were now 9 people and 1 dog. The boat was riding low. Tanner had to trim it carefully. Strand's boots were in an inch of water at the stern. The fuel gauge read 18%. "Bill," Ramirez said quietly, "if we make any more stops—" "No more stops," Tanner said. "Triage straight in." Dorothea Kingsley was sat between Warren Reese and Miriam Ellis. Warren put his blanket around her shoulders. Dorothea looked at him and said, "Chief, you're still alive?" "Barely, Dot. I thought you were dead. You and me both." Dorothea looked at the dog on the bow. Then she looked at Strand. "That is the boy's dog," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "That is Marcus's dog." "Yes, ma'am." Dorothea nodded to herself. "I used to see them," she said. "Marcus and that puppy. Marcus used to walk him past my porch when the boy was still in a stroller. That puppy would sit at my step and wait for a biscuit." Warren Reese smiled for the first time in a long time. Voss, in the middle of the boat, was looking at his hands. He was not looking at anyone. The rain had thinned a little, not much, enough that Tanner could see the flare at the triage from 4 blocks away. He nosed the boat toward it. Ranger, on the bow, turned his head one more time and looked back at Strand. Strand looked back at him. They did not need to say anything to each other. At the triage dock, they unloaded the passengers one by one. The Ellis family went first because of Miriam's arm and the 4-year-old. Then Dorothea Kingsley, who was walked up the ramp by 2 volunteers with a folding chair. Then Denise and Emily Voss, because Denise was going into hypoglycemia and needed to be sent immediately to the hospital wing. Then Warren Reese, who refused a wheelchair and walked the ramp with his hand on Ranger's collar, and Ranger walked beside him like a soldier walking a general. Voss came last. He stood on the ramp for a moment. He looked at Tanner. "Thank you," Voss said. Tanner did not respond. Voss started to walk past. Grant Ellis, who was standing at the top of the ramp with his family, stepped forward. "The sirens," Grant said. "You shut off the sirens." Voss's face went very still. "I don't know what you're on this block. Blackthorn, the sirens didn't sound. That's a maintenance question. I don't... Your HOA has the contract." Voss opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Grant Ellis, and then he looked at Warren Reese, who was standing behind Grant and watching him with the face that a Navy chaplain gets after 30 years of watching men lie. He looked at Strand, who was watching him too. He looked at Tanner. He looked at Dorothea Kingsley, who was 79 years old and had spent 3 hours on top of a chimney because there had been no siren to tell her to leave. Voss said, "I don't remember the exact—" "You do remember," Warren Rees said quietly. There was a long silence. Then Voss walked past them into the triage tent. He did not look at anyone. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at his daughter. Grant Ellis watched him go. Then Grant said quietly to Warren, "He's going to be arrested for this, isn't he?" "Someone is going to ask him a lot of questions," Warren said. "And this time, someone is going to listen." Yes. The county board did open an investigation on Landon Voss the following Tuesday. It took 11 months. It resulted in 3 counts of criminal negligence, 1 count of tampering with emergency infrastructure, 1 count of official misconduct, and a civil settlement with the families of Blackthorn Street that took his development company down to studs. Grant Ellis got his job back with the county engineer's office 6 weeks after the flood. He also got a commendation from the state and an interview on the state's morning news show and a letter of apology, hand-signed, from the paper that had refused to run his story 8 months earlier. Grant Ellis was not the sort of man who kept things like that. He gave the commendation to his oldest boy, and he framed the letter of apology and hung it in his garage. But that is later. That night, at the triage dock, Tanner refueled from a jerry can and looked at his list. He had 5 names left. He had 4 hours of night left. He had a captain's gut that told him the water was still rising, and he had a boat, and he had 2 firefighters who were young and tired and were not going to say no, and he had Derek Strand, who was already back at the bow with Ranger, checking the spotlight. They went back out. They pulled a woman named Alma Torres and her 2 teenage sons off the roof of a beauty salon at 11:15. They pulled an 84-year-old man named Ferris Boone out of a bathtub in a second-floor bathroom at 11:40. They pulled a college kid named Trevor, who had refused to leave his apartment because his cat was under the bed, off a fire escape at midnight with the cat, in a cat carrier that he had somehow managed to keep dry. Every time, Ranger stood on the bow. Every time he read the water the way he had read it the first time. Twice he barked once at a heading, and twice Tanner turned the wheel. Neither time did they regret it. At 12:45, they went back to triage to unload. Rachel Reese was there. She had left the hospital. She had ridden across town in the back of a National Guard truck to be there. She was in her hospital scrubs and a wool coat that was 2 sizes too big for her. When she saw her father-in-law get off the boat, she cried again, but it was a different kind of crying. It was the kind of crying where you know your family is small, but it is intact. Warren held her for a long time. Then she looked past him at Strand. Strand had gotten off the boat to help unload. He was standing there in the rain in his coat, with his hair plastered to his forehead. Rachel walked across the dock to him. She stopped in front of him. She looked at his face. "You knew him," she said. It was not a question. Strand's throat moved. "Yes, ma'am." "You knew Marcus?" "Yes, ma'am." "You were with him?" "At the end?" "Yes." Rachel Reese, who had lost her husband when her son was 5 years old, who had spent 4 years running a household and a career on her own, who had learned to sleep with the porch light on because she did not like the dark anymore, put her hand on the wet lapel of a man she had never met and said, in a very quiet voice, tell me one thing. Tell me one thing," he said. Strand did not answer for a moment. Then he said your name. He said your name, and then he said Caleb's name. And then he said, quote, "Tell them I heard the last song." Just like that. He said, "Tell them I heard the last song." Rachel Reese put her hand over her mouth. She turned her face into the shoulder of Strand's coat. She was crying without sound. Warren Reese behind her closed his eyes. Strand said softly above her head, "It was a Willie Nelson record. He played it that morning, on the compound, on a Bluetooth speaker. It played the whole way through. I remember. He asked me if I'd ever heard it. It was that song about the road going on forever. I said no. He said, then you missed a good one. And that was... Rachel nodded into his coat. She could not speak. Strand looked past her, at Warren. Warren said quietly, "Thank you, son." "Yes, sir," Strand said. Tanner came up. He had the fuel report and the next set of coordinates, and the rain was thinning further. He waited a respectful step back, and after a moment Rachel stepped back too, wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, and looked at him. "Captain Tanner," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "How is my son?" "He's stable. He's asking for the dog." Rachel laughed. It surprised her. It came out of her like a hiccup. "That figures." "He was on the boat all night," Tanner said. "He'll bring him, won't you, Derek?" Strand nodded. "Yes, sir." But Ranger did not want to go inside yet. He stood on the dock beside Strand with his ears up and his tail level, and he looked east. He whined once. Warren watched him. "He's not done," Warren said. Strand looked at him. "He's not done," Warren said again. "He's telling you." Tanner looked at the fuel gauge. "One more run. If Derek says one more, we do one more." Strand crouched down. He put his face level with Ranger's. He looked into those pale eyes and he said, "You showing me?" Ranger licked his chin once. He turned and put one paw on the boat rail. "Okay," Strand said. "Okay, boy. One more." The last run of the night took them back to the neighborhood off Ridge Road, which was where Voss had said his own house was. Voss had gotten off the boat at triage. Voss had walked into the tent. Voss had not asked about his neighbors on Ridge Road. Voss had asked, as they later learned, for a hot cup of coffee and a phone charger. But Ranger was tracking to Ridge Road, and Tanner did not question it, and Strand did not question it, and Ramirez did not question it, and Delaney did not question it. They left triage at 1:15, and they nosed the boat up past the flooded intersection of Ridge and Poplar, and Ranger, on the bow, made a small motion of his head, and Tanner turned the boat toward a 2-story with a wrap-around porch and a picture window that had blown out. There was a light on in the second floor. They pulled up under the porch overhang. Strand shone the light up. On the second-floor window, someone had pressed a white pillowcase against the glass. He shouted up, "Fire rescue! Anyone in there?" A window came up. A woman leaned out. She was Hispanic, in her mid-50s, with a scarf over her hair. Behind her was a very old man in a wheelchair. They were on the second floor of a house that was not their house. "Please," the woman called down. "Please, there is a man. There is a man in the water." "In the water. In the water. In the water. He fell in. He was climbing over the fence and he fell in. We tried. I tried. I can't get to him." Strand looked at Tanner. "Where?" Tanner called up. The woman pointed frantically to the side yard. "There! There! In the please!" Strand was over the side of the boat before Tanner could react. He had a rope on. He had his headlamp on. Ramirez fed the rope. Ranger stood on the bow with his ears forward and his nose down, and just before Strand went under, he barked once and jerked his head to a spot 10 feet off the port side, near what had once been a hedge. Strand went for that spot. There was a body in the water. It was face down. It was tangled in the hedge, and the man was maybe 50 pounds heavier than Strand, and Strand got both arms under his shoulders and kicked hard and broke him free of the branches. He turned him. He got his mouth up. The man coughed water. He was still alive. The man was Landon Voss. Voss had left the triage tent 40 minutes earlier. Voss had told nobody. Voss had gotten into a public works truck and had driven it down to the last intersection where the truck could go and had walked from there. His wife had been at the hospital wing. His daughter had gone with her. Voss had wanted, later he would say in a taped statement, to see if a paper file in his home office had been destroyed by water. He had been climbing his own neighbor's fence to reach his own back property. He had fallen. He had been face down in the water for something like 4 minutes when Ranger picked him up. Strand hauled him to the boat. Ramirez and Delaney pulled. They got Voss over the rail. He vomited water onto the deck. He was gasping. He was alive. Strand climbed in after him. He was soaked. He was shaking with cold. He knelt next to Voss. Voss looked at him. He knew who Strand was. "You," Voss said. His voice was a rasp. "You." "Yeah," Strand said. "Why?" Strand did not answer. He looked at Ranger. Ranger was standing on the bow again. He was looking at Strand with those pale, steady eyes, and Strand understood in that moment something he would understand better and better as the years went on, which was that the dog had not made a distinction. The dog had heard a man in the water. The dog had found a man in the water. That was the entire job. The rest, who deserved to be found and who did not, was a human question, and the dog was not going to be the one to answer it. The dog was going to point at the person and let the humans decide the rest. Strand pulled a blanket off the pile and threw it over Voss. "Bill," he said, "we're done." "Yeah," Tanner said, "we're done." They pulled the woman and the elderly man out of the second-floor window with a rope harness. Her name was Alicia. The old man was her father. They had been trapped in an unfamiliar house because Voss had convinced her, 20 minutes before the water came, to move her father into that house because the porch was easier to wheel him up onto than his own. Voss had wanted to buy her father's actual house for 6 months. He had told her the porch offer as a courtesy. He had not told her the sirens were off. Alicia rode back to triage in silence. She held her father's hand. She looked at Voss, who was wrapped in a blanket on the deck, twice, and both times her face did not change. When they got to triage at 2:15, Ranger jumped off the boat before anyone told him to. He walked, on tired legs, across the dock and up the ramp and past the tents and along the parking lot to where the ambulances were staged. He walked past every one of them. He walked to the door of the mobile clinic where Rachel Reese was waiting with Caleb, who was sedated but conscious, in a wheelchair. Ranger walked up to Caleb's chair. He put his head in the boy's lap. Caleb closed his eyes and smiled. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy, you brought them." Rachel Reese put her hand on top of the dog's head, and she held it there, and she did not say a word. The dam upstream did not fully collapse. It came within 8 feet of it. It came within 8 feet of failing entirely, at which point the town of Ashland Bend would have gone under a further 4 to 5 feet of water, and the death count would have been in the hundreds instead of the 7, where it eventually stopped. The Corps of Engineers, in a report that took 8 months to publish, said the levee sections that Grant Ellis had flagged the previous February were the sections that had gone first, and that they had failed at exactly the pressure Grant had predicted, and that had the sections been repaired, the town would have taken only minor damage. Landon Voss recovered from his near drowning after 2 nights at Providence Hospital. He was arrested on the 3rd morning in a hospital gown by 2 officers of the state police on charges that eventually became 14 separate counts. He was released on bond, and then his bond was revoked 8 weeks later when a second victim from another neighborhood testified that Voss had also privately paid an inspector to backdate reports on a bridge that no longer existed. In the end, Voss served 4 years in state prison. His wife did not divorce him. She loved him more than most people understood, and love does what it does, but she moved to her sister's town and never came back. His daughter Emily transferred out of the state university and moved to the coast and eventually became a public defender. She told a reporter years later that the flood was the night she figured out who she was and who she was not. Grant Ellis's job was reinstated the following March. He was promoted the March after. He and Miriam had a 4th child 18 months after the flood, a girl, and they named her Willow, after the street where the rescue boat had launched. Dorothea Kingsley moved into the assisted living wing at Providence and lived sharply and stubbornly for another 6 years. She told the story of the chimney to anyone who came to visit her. She always ended the story the same way. She would say, And that dog looked at me from that boat, and I knew before those firemen knew that we were going to be all right, because that dog was not scared, and a dog knows. Warren Reese moved in with Rachel and Caleb 3 weeks after the flood. It was Rachel's idea. Warren pretended to fight it and lost. He took over the front room, and he read the paper on the porch in the mornings, and he took Caleb to school on the mornings when Rachel worked a night shift, and he lived long enough to see Caleb graduate from the 8th grade, and long enough to see Caleb start 9th grade. And he passed one night in his sleep on a Tuesday in March, quietly. At the age of 76, Ranger was on the bed beside him. Rachel Reese did not remarry. She did not want to. She said more than once to close friends that she had gotten more from one man than most women got from 3, and that she was grateful, and that her hands were full and her hands would remain full, and thank you but no. She got a promotion to nurse manager at Providence when Caleb was 11. She started a small annual scholarship in Marcus's name for the child of any first responder in Ashland Bend who had lost a parent in the line of duty. The scholarship still exists. Caleb Reese healed. He had a hairline fracture in one rib and a bad cut over one eye and a concussion that took a month to fully clear. He was back at school by the middle of November. He did not remember the porch. He did not remember the water. He remembered being lifted, and he remembered a hand under his head, and he remembered Ranger's face, and he remembered a man in a wet coat leaning over him and saying, "You're okay, buddy. You're okay." He grew up. He grew tall. He grew to be very much his father's son, and he grew to look enough like his father that Warren Reese sometimes had to look twice when Caleb walked into a room. He played baseball. He was not very good at it. He was better at swimming. He joined a junior swim team when he was 12. He was recruited to a college team when he was 17. He went on to serve, eventually, though not in the same branch as his father. Rachel had been very clear about her one condition on that subject, and he served with distinction, and he came home in one piece. That's later. That night at the hospital, when they finally got Caleb settled in a room, and Warren was in the room next door for observation, and Rachel had sat down for the first time in 19 hours, Derek Strand walked in. He had changed out of his wet gear. He was in a clean sweatshirt and a pair of borrowed pants, and his hair was still damp, and his arms were bandaged from the lattice nail, and he was holding a plastic bag from the hospital gift shop that contained a single item, which was a stuffed golden retriever with a red bandana. He held it out to Rachel. I don't know if he'd... Rachel took the bag from him and set it on the chair. Then she stood up and put both her arms around him and hugged him. She hugged him hard. She hugged him for a long time. Strand did not know what to do at first. Then he put his arms around her back and he held her. "Marcus talked about you," she said into his shoulder. "He did. He said his best friend in the teams was a kid from Kansas City who couldn't tell a joke. He said you were a good man." Strand laughed. It came out as a small, wet sound. "He also said," Rachel said, pulling back, wiping her face, "that you owed him $74. Strand looked at her. His face did something. "I did," he said. "He was right. It was a bar tab in Coronado. He wrote it in his book. I still have the book. He kept a book of things you owed him." That sounds like him. He wrote, "I remember," he wrote, "Derek Strand, $74 for beer at O'Malley's, and after your name," he wrote, "Forgive if I don't make it." Strand looked at her. "I brought the dog home," Rachel said. "That was what I could do. That was the last thing. The dog wasn't home yet. He'd left him with his sister when he deployed. And I went and I got the dog because that was the last thing Marcus asked me for, and I did it, and I brought him home to Caleb, and Caleb, when he saw that dog, was the first time he laughed since the funeral. Caleb was 5. That dog has been Caleb's since Caleb was 5. Strand nodded. He could not speak. "That dog led you to my son," Rachel said. "That dog led you to Warren. That dog led you to all those people. And I don't know how he knew. But I know one thing. I know Marcus taught him. Marcus trained him the first year before he deployed the last time. Marcus was crazy about training that puppy. Marcus said he was smart. I never really understood, but he said this dog could think. She wiped her face again. He said the dog listened. Strand stood there for a long time. Then he reached into the front pocket of his sweatshirt. He pulled out a small object. It was a whistle. It was silver. It was old. It had been around his neck for 9 years. Marcus and I had these, he said, in selection. It was a stupid tradition. Our instructor gave them out to the guys who made it through Hell Week. Different pitch on everyone. He said we should keep them for the rest of our lives, and if we ever needed our brothers, we should blow them and any of the guys in earshot would come running. He held the whistle out. I want Caleb to have this, he said, when he's older. Rachel took it. She held it in both hands. Blow it, Strand said. Blow it now, just once. Rachel looked at him. She blew it. The whistle made a small, high, thin sound. It was almost too high to hear. On the other side of the wall in the visitor's room, where a big shepherd mix was lying on a folded blanket with his head between his paws, Ranger's ears came up. He stood. He walked to the door of the visitor's room, and he pushed it open with his nose. And he walked down the corridor, and he came into Caleb's room, and he crossed the room, and he lay down beside the bed where Caleb was sleeping. Strand watched him. His eyes were wet. I thought so, he said quietly. Marcus said in his letter he had trained the dog on our whistle. That was the joke. He said, if any of the boys come by and blow the whistle, the dog will find them, because they were his brothers, and the dog would be his brother's dog too. That was Marcus. Rachel Reese put both hands to her mouth and cried. Strand sat down heavily in the chair by the bed. They sat like that for a long time, the two of them, in the dim room at 3 a.m, while a small boy slept, and while an old man slept in the room next door, and while a big shepherd mix that had once belonged to a Navy SEAL, who died on a beach 4 years ago, slept on the floor with his chin on the boy's foot. Outside, the rain had stopped. That was the night, and that was the story. If you had been on Hargrove Street the next morning, you would have seen a strange landscape, furniture on lawns, cars turned sideways, a single boat the wrong way up on top of a carport. You would also have seen, on porches all over Ashland Bend, small groups of neighbors sitting on chairs and talking, because a town that had almost drowned in the night had, in the morning, discovered that it was still there. You would also have seen, if you drove out toward the fire station on Willow, a Ford pickup pulled into the parking lot with a captain named Bill Tanner leaning against it and drinking a coffee that was still hot for once. You would have seen him nod at his 2 young firefighters as they came in for shift change. You would have seen him say, in a very quiet voice, "That was the longest night of my life." You would have seen Derek Strand standing beside him, look at the sky and say, "Yes, it was." You would have seen them both go back inside and put on dry gear and go out again, because there was still a town that needed hands. But you would not, if you had been standing there, have seen the whole shape of what had happened. You would only have seen its edges. The whole shape was smaller than a town and bigger than a night. The whole shape was a 9-year-old boy on a porch and a man in a boat, and it was a woman running an ER, and it was a chaplain in a dormer window, and it was a family in an attic, and it was a widow with a diabetic condition, and a college kid with a cat, and an 84-year-old man in a bathtub, and a 79-year-old woman on a chimney, and a middle-aged real estate developer in a hedge, and a dog with pale eyes on a bow. Ashland Bend rebuilt over the next 4 years. The Ellis family moved back onto Blackthorn Street, into the same house, and Grant built a new porch himself with cedar boards, and he put up a new railing that was not aluminum. He built it wide enough for a wheelchair. He did that on purpose, though nobody in his household needed one, because he had seen a woman on a chimney, and he had promised himself he would build a house that could hold a neighbor. Warren Reese, before he died, walked the neighborhood one afternoon in the fall, when he was 75, with Ranger on a leash beside him. He walked past the house where Dorothea Kingsley had lived, which had been demolished and rebuilt as a single story with wider hallways, and he tipped his hat at her when she came out to sit on her new porch. He walked past the Ellis house, and he waved at Miriam, who was hanging out laundry, and Miriam waved back. He walked past the empty lot where the Voss home had once stood, and he did not tip his hat there, but he did stop, and he did put his hand on top of Ranger's head, and he said something under his breath that only he and the dog heard. He walked past his own house, which was Rachel's house now. He walked up the porch steps. He sat down on the porch swing. Caleb was in the front yard raking leaves. Caleb was 13. He was tall for his age. He turned when Warren sat down and he grinned, and the grin was Marcus's grin. And Warren felt his eyes prick and he said, "You want a soda, Chief?" "Yeah, kid," Warren said. "Yeah, I do." Caleb came up the steps and he sat next to Warren on the swing, and they sat there together, an old man and a boy, in the fall of a good year, with the dog between their feet. That is not the ending you wanted. The ending you wanted is on the porch too. It is on a Sunday afternoon in the following March. Rachel is inside making sandwiches. Warren is in his room. Ranger is on the porch, older, grayer at the muzzle, with the same pale eyes that never lost their intelligence. And on the porch step, sitting with a cup of coffee balanced on his knee, is Derek Strand. He has been coming by once a month or so, ever since. He does not stay long. He fixes small things. He hangs a light. He replaces a step. He has become, in the way these things become, a kind of uncle. Rachel calls him D. Caleb calls him D. Warren calls him Chief, because Warren calls every man in a uniform chief, and it is his private joke. That Sunday, Caleb comes out with a paper bag. He is 15. He is going to a friend's house. He stops on the porch. He looks at Strand. "D," Caleb says. "Yeah, kid." "Mom said you were the one who found me on the porch that night." Strand looks up. "Yeah." "Mom said Ranger led you." "Yeah." "Is that true?" Strand thinks about it for a second. Then he says, "It's true. Every word of it. Your dog swam through a flood in the dark, and he brought us to you. I don't know how he did it. I never will. But he did it. You know why?" Caleb shakes his head. "Because your dad taught him," Strand says, "and your dad was very good at teaching." Caleb looks at Ranger. Ranger, on the porch boards, opens one eye and looks up at him. Caleb kneels down. He puts his forehead against Ranger's forehead. He stays there for a moment. Then he stands up. He picks up his paper bag. He grins at Strand. He goes down the steps. He turns at the sidewalk. He waves. Strand waves back. Ranger closes his eye. The porch is quiet. The wind moves through the maples. The porch swing moves half an inch and then stops. That is the ending. You can see, if you look for it, the exact spot where the porch railing used to be broken. Grant Ellis had come over and helped Warren rebuild it the summer after the flood, and they had made it the same wood as the rest of the porch, so that you could not tell unless you knew. But you can tell if you know. There is one board that is a shade lighter than the others. That is where the lattice fell. That is where Caleb was pinned. That is where a 9-year-old boy waited in the dark for someone to find him. And that is where the world sent him a dog. Now I want to ask you something. If you made it this far with me, and you felt this story, tap that like button, tell me in the comments what you would have named a dog like Ranger, and hit subscribe so the next story doesn't slip past you. Because there are more like this one, and there are more just as true, and I would very much like to tell them to you. Take care of each other out there. And if a dog ever looks at you like it knows something you don't, trust the dog. Trust the dog every time.